everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Scott Holstein, and I am the Director of Marketing and Business Development for Computrols. As you may know, Computrols is best known for our building automation solutions, particularly HVAC control, but we also control lighting, access, and fire alarm systems as well. And we should take about 30-35 minutes here today. That's about what we're aiming for. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Mike.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate that. Hello, everybody. So today, the topic is going to be CBAS system tips and lesser-known features. We surveyed some of our longtime technicians with the question of, if you could tell somebody one thing about CBAS that they don't know, what would it be? And we got some good feedback from that, so we wanted to share that. And then also we want to give you a preview of CBAS 20, which is currently being released. We've made some efforts to polish up that interface and kind of bring it forward without drastically changing it too much. So we hope you like it, and we'll show you that momentarily. So the first thing we're going to start off, that's a tip, is regarding the MNS3 LCD stat. And for those of you not familiar with it, you probably have seen this. It's typically used with our VAV, or the unitary product, or even the stat interface board to be used with the X or LX controllers. One of the features that's lesser known about this stat is that you can actually go to any of these sensors and press the up and down arrow for about 4 seconds together. And what you'll be then shown is the word or the letters ADD followed by a number. And that number is the address of the controller that this sensor is connected to. So if you're out on an occupied floor or a place with a lot of these sensors, it's a very quick and easy way to verify which controller that sensor is connected to without having to look to a print or something else. So one of those lesser known features, but pretty handy if you need it. Works on any LCD stat with the humidity or not, and works on any one of the 3 Computrols controllers that support it. Again, the VAV product, the Uni product, or the stat interface product. So the next thing we'd like to discuss is shortcuts for CBAS. If you're familiar with what a shortcut is, it's a link to a program on your computer, and it usually looks like this. CBAS, a version number, and EXE, where you're linking to the program. And when you open CBAS, you're allowed to pick which mode you want to open it in. So what we can do is quickly jump into one of the various modes that CBAS has, GW, workstation mode, editor mode, real mode, by adding to those shortcuts the words mode equals editor, mode equals GW. And most of you are familiar with that. But when it comes to workstations, you can add a few more things, such as the name of the workstation you want to connect as and the IP address you want to connect to, all in the shortcut, and save you from having to enter those into the program. So this is a little bit longer, so I'll have to scroll back over. But if you look at this shortcut here, we have the usual mode equals GW to indicate we want CBAS to go into workstation mode, but then we go on to specify what client we want to connect as, in this case, security. And then we also specify the remote IP address of the DPU or the head end that we want to connect to. So you're able to put all of that into the shortcut and make that shortcut specific for that site, so you never have to worry about going to enter the information in the CBAS to pick the workstation you want to go to. So handy little trick there. Another mode, while we're talking about CBAS mode, that's a little underutilized is the simulator mode. You get to this one, again, by doing the shortcut and simply adding the word mode equals simulator. And I should point out that you can make a shortcut at any time by right-clicking on it, and then you can send to the desktop as a create a shortcut. So that's the way to create these, or just copy it and paste it. And when you add, for instance, in this case, mode equals simulator, what we do is enter sort of a virtual mode where we trick CBAS into thinking it's actually connected live to a building. And what you're presented with is what looks like a running CBAS instance. And then at the top, it'll say simulator mode. Now, right off the bat, you'll notice if you go to any inputs, these are things you typically can't command, you'll now see a simulate input button where you can command that point to a value. Or, for example, a binary input, we can go change its status. So what simulator allows us to do is command those inputs to certain values and then watch any associated logic or program evaluate through those changes. So this is a fantastic tool to get started with if you're just sort of learning CBAS, or if you want to try out some programming in kind of a test bed environment. You don't actually have to have any hardware with you to do that. It's also important to note that if you go to some older documentation, it'll mention some limitations to simulator in terms of number of controllers it can simulate at one time. That, going back a few versions now to, let's say, version 17 or so and later, that limitation no longer applies. So you can simulate any controller in a database, or excuse me, any number of controllers in the database all together at the same time. So great little nifty tool if you want to, test out some programming, or again, give someone a little environment that they can work in to evaluate. So let's jump into CBAS and show a couple features from within CBAS. So one that's really underutilized is the notepad feature. And if you go to any point in the system and you click on a point, there's an ability to create a notepad here. It's also available, the same exact button is in CBAS here, create notepad. Now what we can do is create notes for users. 24, 2020. And we can leave notes, and these become part of the database, and they're backed up with backups, and they're great little reports to have handy. But one thing people don't leverage a lot is display this notepad each time this point is selected. And what this does is if someone comes along after the fact and clicks that point, they'll now be presented with that note that they can dismiss by closing out or right-clicking to get into the next screen. So it's a handy way of conveying information, especially if we're leaving points off or commanding points off for a certain reason. We can leave that reason here instead of having to go write it down in an engineer's log somewhere. They're also handy to do things like punch lists. You can create just a binary point and throw punch list notes in there. Or if you want to have a nice handy track in a database of all the IP addresses, it's important to remember all this data, including notes, gets backed up in the backup process, so you have a record of it. If you'd like a quick way to verify all of the notepad entries in CBAS, there's a handy notepad report. And if you run this, it'll actually run a report listing out all the various notepad entries that have been programmed into the system. So you can get a nice handy printed record of all those. Alarm summary is often used to show you all the points that are currently active in alarm in CBAS. Another question that comes up from time to time is how many points do I have alarms configured on? In other words, I'd like to know how many of these points exist, not necessarily if they're an alarm now or not. We can come to program summary, which is a quick way to show me all of the points that have an alarm configured on them. So in this case, all of these points have alarms enabled. They're not necessarily an alarm, but I can tell quickly that they're set up. And that same sort of filtering can be used on reports as well. So that program summary is the key there. In other words, that tells me what points have this sort of programming on them, not just whether they're an alarm or not. Going back to the text view, again, logical groups. You're probably familiar with these. These are preset sets of groups of points that you create. But a lot of people don't realize you can nest them. And by nesting them, meaning we build this hierarchy here where you can penetrate up and down levels and group things a little more efficiently than just a big, long list. And the way you do this is under Edit Logical Groups, you create that group. And instead of making it the root, meaning a parent level, you can come pick another group to place it underneath. So you can really, if you put a little work in here, get a nice efficient flow for operators where they can go penetrate to, let's say at a campus environment, they can go down to a building, system type, floor, point type, et cetera. For those of you that were eagle-eyed, you probably noticed at the top here some unusual colors for what you might normally see in CBAS, the blue and the green. So what we can do, and this only applies to a few types of specific points, namely binary inputs, binary outputs that are software that exist in the front end or in the DPU and not in a controller. If you have those type of points, what you can do is configure an alarm on the point, but instead of actually going into alarm, we just want to change the point color only. And I can pick which color I want to use for this. And I can define the condition here, and I can actually send it by another point if I wish. So you have 4 colors to choose from. And again, binary input, binary output that are in the front end. And these are pretty handy if you really want to call attention out to something visually in CBAS, just because they're so different than the normal light blue, red, and yellow colors that you see here. Another thing that comes up, if I were to ask you how to go place an alarm on a controller, you want to know if a particular controller goes offline and you want to send an email. You would typically go to Hardware View, go to the controller channel, come to the controllers, select the controller, and then go to Program, and then here's where you set up the alarm. So quite a few clicks to get to that controller. A lot of people don't realize that every single item in CBAS software, including a controller, is represented by a point. So there is an option under Configure Workstation that says Show Controllers in All Points, and I've already checked this previously. When this is enabled, what you now see in the All Points is a listing of the controllers, and in this case, the Central Plant 64-point LX controller is shown here. And I can turn it on or off scan, I can select Program, come place the alarm here, change its IP, etc. So instead of having to go to Hardware View and then do a few clicks to get to it, I can have them front and center on the All Points if it's of interest to you. And again, you have the option to turn that on or off. It's actually off by default in CBAS. You would have to go turn it on manually. Another thing you might notice, if you're not familiar, are these bold bars and bold text. These kind of help, again, as divider lines. They visually catch your eye and help separate things. Well, there's a couple ways to turn those bold features on. One way is to go to a controller, come to go to a program screen, and you could select whether you want to see the dark bar or dark font and turn those on and off there. A much quicker way is to use the function keys on your keyboard, the F3 and F4 keys, namely. If I were to press the F3 key here, F3 key here, F4 key there, you notice I can toggle these bolds on and off, F4 on, off, F3 off, F3 off. So you can use the F3 and F4 keys to quickly apply those bold features or turn them on and off. And again, provide some separation to the all points and make it visually a little more appealing. Another feature is show point relations. This is a handy way to go to any point that's part of a sequence and determine how it's being referenced by any other points in the system. Let's come to this chill water supply tap here. There appears to be no logic programmed on this point, but there may be some referencing me that I don't know about. So how do I quickly find that? We use the show point relations button. So notice I'm on the secondary chill water supply temp point, but if I hit relations, it actually tells me that some logic is referencing me and that I have an alarm program. But this logic is on this delta T calc. And if I click that, the software actually jumps me over to that point that's referencing me and lets me see how I'm being referenced quickly. And then I could back out of that and go back to the point I was at. So this is very handy if you're working with a system that you weren't necessarily the one that did the programming on, or if someone else did it for you and you're trying to take a deeper dive and understand what's happening. You can use that point to gauge and understand how that point is being linked either to other points or from other points. You're also eagle-eyed. You may have noticed the sunrise and sunset points up here, which are some values that we can then use for lighting control and things like that. How do we get those into CBAS? Well, there's a formula that's math that's above my grade, where you can basically take the latitude and longitude of any point on the globe, and you can tell or predict what the sunrise and sunset time is going to be. The way you set that up, the way we tell CBAS where we're at, is we go to database maintenance, and there is a sunrise calculation point. And here's where you actually enter in the latitude and longitude, and it'll actually calculate here. So we can set up those values, let CBAS know where we're at in terms of latitude and longitude. You can just Google lat and long for your address. And then we'll get those values, and then we can enter them into CBAS, and again, use as lighting control. And there's also some points for offset, so we can say I want to know, a binary point that changes 15 minutes before sunset, and I can use that for parking lot lights or things like that. So handy little feature built in for free in every version of CBAS. And then speaking of formulas and calcs, if we go underneath the help file, which is underneath system, there's a button called formulas and calculations. And there's a couple handy dandy calculators built right here. You don't have to go online searching for them. Things like duct area calc. Can put in my square or round duct measurements, get my area based off of that. If I want to calculate CFM, I can actually do that. And we actually explain the formula that's used in most of our templates. is explained out here, so you can run through that calc manually if you wish. If you're trying to remember the color coding for making patch cables, you can do that yourself here. Little guide in case you forget what those colors are. And then if you're doing access control, we'll show you how to wire in a diode across a door strike to help with a collapsing field on larger strikes. So all that stuff built in, free for you to use, easy to get to. So earlier, jumping back to text view for a moment, we talked about points that live in the DPU or logic that lives in the DPU. From a programming standpoint, we want as much logic as possible in the controller because we want that programming to function even if the computer is offline. And that's why the memory and flash memory, that's what that does for you.
All right. With that said, thank you all again for attending, and have a great day.
But a question will often come up, how do I tell what programming is in the front end? Underneath Advanced Filter, and this filter box is, again, used in a lot of locations for copy functions, report functions. It allows us to select a precise group of points. In this case, it's pretty simple to determine what points are only in the front end. We simply say show points in the DPU, and we come to this program summary. Now, earlier, we used this to determine which points had alarms programmed on them. Now I want to see which points have logic on them that are only in the DPU. And when I run that report, here's the result. So I can quickly see and sort any logic that's in the front end. If I have something that's in the front end that shouldn't be, I can quickly identify that and address it from this view. Lastly, what I'd like to show you in terms of a little hidden CBAS tip and trick is if you go into graphics mode, any of you who have set up workstations before are probably familiar with the process of getting graphics from the front end out to a GW. You put them on a flash drive, you got to copy it around. It's a little bit of a labor-intensive process. What CBAS has is in the graphics programming mode. So if I click on this and go to graphics programming mode, on the workstation that I'm working with, there's a graphic image sync button. If I click this, this will actually talk to the front end and query it for what graphic images are present on it and let me know which ones don't exist on my machine. And then I can actually hit sync and it'll copy those all over automatically. So I don't have to worry about manually copying them, making sure that I have the background images propagated out to each GW. Simply go to the GW, fire up graphics programming, hit synchronize, and it'll take care of that copy for you. So that kind of wraps it up for our tips and tricks on 19 that I was showing you here. What I'm going to do now is switch over to CBAS 20 and show you what we've done here. Okay, so with CBAS 20, one of the mentions, as I mentioned early on, one of the goals we had was to polish the interface, but not drastically rework it to the point where you're frustrated because you can't find the way you used to do things in CBAS. Those of us who've ever, done a Windows upgrade or a Microsoft Office upgrade, that a lot of times, a quote unquote upgrade can lead to a lot of frustration because things that you're used to doing are different now for the sake of being different. So keeping that in mind, we wanted to set out and refine the look and interface, look and feel of it. Okay. So starting off with the all points view, you notice that we have a dark theme, and I should mention that we have the option under workstation to go with light or dark. CBAS 20 is shipping with dark theme enabled by default, but you can very easily go back to the old familiar color scheme if that's what you prefer. So right off the bat, we polished up, got a nice dark color theme here with proper contrast, a little bit easier on the eyes, we think. If I penetrate into a point and come down one level further, you notice that the icon set has been completely revamped. So the logic, symbol doesn't have the little 1990s looking brain on it, things like that. So completely refined that area. New color palette's been set up. Boxes and headings and things have all been touched. There's well over 400 individual screens like this in the CBAS software, and each one of those was individually touched by the graphic artist. Notice nothing's moved. Nothing's changed in terms of how you go about your workflow. It just, in our opinion, looks a lot better than it has historically. So a lot of features built in there. There's a new help button that's coming back. If old timers may remember this, but what we're doing now is we're implementing a web-based help function that is going to be context sensitive. And what that means is that if the software is going to know, if I'm working on the point program screen and I ask for help, take me to that section of the manual that deals with what I'm doing, not just the main front page or the index. So every one of these screens that has a help button will take you to the relevant section of the manual that addresses with it. So we think that'll be a welcome change back. You'll notice in the all points here that there's another column here. Historically, the priority and condition of a point, meaning if it was an operator or an alarm, was stacked on the same view, the same box. Now, what that could do is cause some issues where if I turned something on by operator and it went into alarm, previously the alarm would cover up the operator priority, so I wouldn't be able to see that. What we've done now is take advantage of modern wide screens and give you this extra column where we're showing you the priority and the condition of the point individually. So you no longer have that case where an alarm or a status of the condition would cover up the priority of a point. We've also done some work in hardware view. If we come to hardware view, go to channels, go to controllers, you'll notice here that the 45 ports, the host and secondary, are shown at the top layer of the controller view. So this is handy because it shows me the deployment of my channels, and it also shows me what's available. So if I know that we want to add a new type of power meter over in a plant, and I'm curious if I have a spare channel or not, I can quickly see that my 64LX has the secondary channel open, so I can use it for a new protocol. And then we've also done some things. You'll notice this is a breadcrumb approach, they call it. And what this is doing is that as I penetrate down, it's showing me my path at the top instead of just opening a new box. So it's keeping the window a little tighter. It looks a little better, flows a little better. And you'll be able to click on these and actually go to that particular level instead of having to back up through each level. So again, little time saver features. We feel it looks a lot better. And a little more efficient here when it comes to looking at the various sub-channels on the controller. So all points, what else can we do with it? So we mentioned here the changes with this, and you notice the two-column view with modern monitors, this amount of space is getting pretty big, meaning between the point name and the value. And it's just a matter of having monitors that are wider, larger, and how do we take advantage of that extra real estate? So we've added a couple options. The default view is that two-column view like we just showed you. But if you come under Configure Workstation, there's a new button called All Point Setup. Now what you can do is turn off that two-column view. When I come back to All Points, you can see now that I have a third area over here that's currently blank. So this area has been tightened up, the amount of blank space. It's a little easier to read now. We're being more concise with that area. So what can I do over here? Well, right off the bat, we're allowing you to turn on Activity View. And what that does, I have to switch to a screenshot to show you what that would look like. Activity View, if you're familiar in CBAS, is where alarms and you can control if you want access control swipes, things like that, all come by in kind of a chronological view. So if you turn that on, and again, it's optional, you can then see this activity view on the right-hand side while you work in All Points, and this will continue to just kind of scroll by. So we have a lot planned for that area of the screen, including possibly showing a graphic at the same time as All Points, giving you some filter buttons, things like that. But the first kind of iteration of 20 is coming out with activity view enabled, and then subsequent releases to 20 this year, as we add to that feature, will be included in the upgrade. So there's also some options regarding All Points here that you can adjust the font size and you can adjust the column width. So if you, depending on your eyesight and your preference, if you want the letters to be smaller or bigger, you can adjust that yourself and actually still kind of customize that view to suit your liking. So again, some cool options here coming in for All Points, and definitely stay tuned because that real estate that you're able to now free up on the right-hand side, we have additional plans for. You'll notice this button that says Dual Monitor Setup. Now, CBAS historically, has not worked very well with dual monitors, meaning you may get some oddities where, depending on which monitor you're running it on, the menu doesn't appear on the correct menu, things like that. So we've added proper monitor support for dual monitors. For example, the shortcuts that we talked about earlier, if you add the word monitor equals 2 to that, you can now force CBAS to launch every time on the second monitor. So it respects which monitor you were running it on and will launch again properly on that monitor. For dual monitor setup, we also have some new options. you can now launch the graphics view and or the activity view in a separate window, meaning I can have graphics on one monitor or activity on one monitor and my all points or another instance of CBAS on the first monitor. And if I do launch it in a separate window, I can even hide the menu bar, alarm bar, status bar. I can kind of customize that a little bit. So what are the results of that? Well, I'm going to run in the real mode here because these views, the dual monitor works in real mode and workstation mode. So if I come back to configure workstation, dual monitor setup, and I say launch graphics view as a separate window. Now, I want you to bear with me for a moment because I'm trying to show a dual monitor application on a single screen. If I go and click graphics after that, what happens is CBAS actually launches another window, and I'm going to minimize it so you can see what that looks like. So imagine, if you will, you have your dual monitor, and here's my primary CBAS, and that's the instance that I ran first, and here's my all points with everything on it. And then here's my graphics view that can list and be driven on another screen. So, one of the uses for this is, imagine you have a central plant. We put a nice, monitor up someplace. I can actually keep this graphic up live on that secondary large monitor, but do my day-to-day CBAS driving on the first monitor. Or maybe I have my access control activity at the security guard on a monitor, but then I can have the HVAC side, running in all points, on the other monitor. So a lot of flexibility here. Sky's the limit on what you do with it, but the idea and the overarching kind of policy is that, look, we've made the investment into making sure that we support dual monitors properly, and now, we feel it opens up CBAS to do some pretty cool things in terms of having graphics and activity displayed at the same time as the other all points views. So I'll close this graphics view. The last new thing for CBAS 20 really involves our distribution partners. And those of you who we've spoken with, are familiar with this change. One thing historically we've done with protocol licenses is we sold them as kind of a one-size-fits-all endeavor where if you need, whether you need a full building of a certain type of third-party protocol or just one or two controllers, the cost was the same. So what we've done is create the ability to license these channels on a per-channel basis. So to help you scale down and maybe go after those smaller jobs or get your foot in the door where you don't have a huge amount of controllers and just maybe need a single channel or a few channels, you can now purchase individual channel licenses. Now, the way that's managed is there's a new screen in CBAS called Channel License Editor. And what this shows is all of the various licenses that you're currently licensed for, how many you're licensed for each, and what your utilization is. And if I come click on that down here, it shows me which ones are licensed or unlicensed, and I can swap them back and forth. So the idea being that if you program 10 channels of a certain type but are only licensed for 5, you get to pick which 5 are actually going to come online and communicate. So we don't limit anything you do with regards to programming. It's just how many can you communicate with simultaneously. So hope is that this will give you a little more flexibility in how you approach the smaller jobs, especially with third-party protocols. And again, the aim was to make this as simple to manage as possible, and we think this licensed distributor screen helps with that. So I appreciate your time. I hope the tips and tricks were informative, and I hope that you're excited about CBAS 20 as we are. We feel like that interface has been long overdue for some touch-ups, and again, we paid careful consideration to not being too drastic with the changes, but trying to polish it where it needed polishing. And hopefully, you're excited about it as we are as well.
All right. Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that. There's a lot of really good information. Thank you all for taking the time out of your busy days to come and attend this webinar. And we hope to see you at our future webinars. Thank you.